Today, in our wheelbarrow series class, we're going to talk about reduced pesticide home apple production. As far as apples go, there are some, or any kind of fruit for that matter, there are some considerations we need to take when uh, figuring out what site we need to plant those on. First off, we need an elevation and a slope of 2 to 10%. What that's going to do is allow cold air, especially in the spring, whenever we may have a late frost, that's going to allow that cold air to sink and the frost will be down in the valleys and it'll be warmer up on the top of the slope, which is, 1 or 2 degree difference can make a difference between having a crop and not having a crop. We also want well-drained soils. Most of our fruit crops, especially apples or most other fruit trees, do not like to have wet soils. And you do need a decent soil, a soil depth of 2.5 feet or more for a good fruit tree production. Soil pH for apples is about 6.5, which is also for most of our fruit trees. Soil fertility is something we'll talk about a little bit later in the PowerPoint. But you want good soil, but you don't have to have great soil, believe it or not, to grow decent tree fruits like apples. Probably not going to need it after the first few years. Most of our fruit trees, once they're established, can withstand most of our droughts. But you may want or need a water source for the first couple years while these trees are getting established. Wouldn't want to send them through a drought in the first couple years that they're out. Another thing is we need to worry about is placement of the trees, because we are going to have to spray these with pesticides, and we need to think about what that drift might go to. So you don't want to plant apple trees near a children or pet area, or somewhere where that the vulnerable could get into some of these pesticides and not know it. Some pests that we have to think about with our fruit trees, especially for apples, are deer. You can see this picture here where deer will rub their antlers on the bark and actually tear it off and girdle the tree. Birds are another one that will actually eat the fruit, peck holes in it, especially apples, especially red apples. Raccoons are another one. Squirrels are another one. They'll climb the tree and eat the fruit. Groundhogs will burrow under and around the tree. They'll also eat the fruit that falls on the ground. And then rabbits, they will gnaw on especially young trees at the base during the winter, with their teeth, sharpening their teeth, and they can girdle those young trees as well. So as you can see, there's several pests that could be a problem with growing apples. This picture here is how to tell if you've had frost injury on a flower. This is an apple flower, but it would be the same if you were growing any other fruit crop. You can see the flower on the left there is nice and green inside, and there is no frost damage. So that flower would have went ahead and produced an apple or gotten pollinated if it didn't have any of the things that happened along the growth of that flower. It would have produced an apple. But on the right there, you can see it's black inside. Usually, by the afternoon of the morning that we had a frost, you can cut these blooms open and you can see that black inside, and you'll know that that ovary actually froze in there. So that flower is no good anymore and will fall off. Apples do need 2 or more varieties for best pollination. You can do that with a lot of different varieties. Most will bloom close together enough to get cross-pollination, but we'll talk about some that definitely we want to plant together to get good cross-pollination. One that a lot of people grow or historically have grown is Yellow Delicious. It's an old apple variety. Most of our grandparents had this in their backyard. It's also called the rooster tree. It is the only self-fruitful apple variety out there, so it will pollinate itself and any of the other apple varieties around it. So it's just a nice all-around apple. If you're only growing it just for pollination's sake, it's a good one to have around in your orchard. It is susceptible to diseases and things, but it's a pretty tough tree overall. In this pollination chart here, you can see that not all of our newer varieties are necessarily on this list, but it just gives you bloom times for apples whenever they will be in bloom, with early, mid, and late. So we need to make sure that when we're planting apples, that they're going to overlap in their bloom sequence, so as we can get pollination. So that's just something to keep in mind there. Let's say Liberty blooms early to mid. If you go down and you planted something like Rome, you're just going to have a little bit of overlap there. So you may want to plant something, if that's the only other apple you have was Liberty, something like Empire or Jonah Gold or something like that to make sure you have a longer pollination overlap. But as you can see, most all of these will overlap at least a little bit, so you will get pollination out of these. As far as yields for an apples, a standard size apple tree, which is quite large, you can get about 8 bushels of apples off of a standard tree. Semi-dwarf, 4 to 8, probably closer to that 4 or 5. And then we have our dwarf, which you can get about a bushel off a dwarf tree. So a dwarf tree is very small when you think about that, but it's still a lot of apples off of one little tree. As far as what apples weigh, a bushel of apples weighs 42 to 48 pounds. So you're looking at a standard apple, you can get almost 200 pounds of apples off that one tree. Fruit trees tend to vary in their life expectancy, and apples are no different. But apples, if you're planting a standard tree, they can live up to 50 years, which is, a standard tree gets 30 feet tall and wide, and it's grown on its own roots, so it's quite vigorous. And 50 years is doesn't seem like a long time in some trees, but for an apple or fruiting tree, that's quite a long time. And then our semi-dwarf and a dwarf, only about 15 to 25 years, so they are grafted onto a less vigorous rootstock, which keeps the plant a little smaller, and it does reduce its life expectancy, well, by about half at least. Fruit crop fertilization is something that we need to take into account. Obviously, if you've not planted an orchard yet, it's a good idea to go ahead and take a soil test. But you do, after the plants are established, you want to fertilize based on plant growth. You may not be needed if you've got a very fertile site. Lawn fertilization, if you've got, can actually fertilize your fruit crops. So if you've got them in your lawn and you regularly fertilize your lawn, there's no need to fertilize your fruit trees separately. Another is once the pre-plant fertilizer is applied, usually only annual applications of nitrogen are needed. So once you've done your soil test and you know how much phosphorus and potassium you need, you've put that down. You probably won't need another phosphorus or potassium application for several more years. So you are going to still need that yearly nitrogen application. And you do want to go ahead and apply that fertilizer beneath your drip line um, of the plant, and that's going to keep don't put it directly on the trunk, but go out to the drip line. The drip line, all that is where your branches, tips stop, go straight down, and that circle around that tree, that's your drip line. So that's where the feeder roots are going to be, and that's where you definitely want to make sure you apply more of your fertilizer there. One general rule, especially for apples, is if it grows a foot in a growing season, and you can look back and see where it grew from the previous year. If it grew a foot or more, there's no need to apply any extra nitrogen. That means that you've got plenty of fertilizer already in that ground, plenty of nitrogen already naturally, so you can forego your nitrogen application for that season. And if you keep getting a foot regularly of growth, then just stop or don't apply any more nitrogen. Because if you get too much nitrogen, you can reduce the amount of flowers you'll get, which will reduce your crop yield. So back to that point, over-fertilization is not good because we want to keep a balance between fruiting and vegetative growth. If we've got a lot of vegetative growth, we're going to get less fruiting. So you do want to keep up with your root to shoot ratio. All that means is you do not want to push a young tree, a new tree that's planted for the first few years. If you put a lot of nitrogen on that plant and water, it's going to tell it to grow a lot of foliage, and that root system is not going to be able to keep up with that, and your plant can blow over. Or you can even you're setting that plant up for some drought damage if we have a dry spell, because they'll have too much shoot at the top to take care of for the roots to take up water and nutrients for it. Another thing to keep in mind, even if you maybe don't have great soil, a heavy pruning is just like it's just like fertilizing. It's easy for me to say, but all that means is if you cut a lot off that tree, you've got less tissue for that tree to have to take care of. So whatever nutrients comes up, it's going to push a big flush of growth out of that tree. So it would act just like if you had applied extra nitrogen or something to it. Another thing about too much nitrogen, it can reduce your winter hardiness, which you can have some dieback, especially if you fertilize too late. And then too much nitrogen also can increase your fruit size, but it can reduce your fruit color, your firmness, and your storability. So you kind of got to keep in mind about how much growth you had on that plant and how much growth or how much you may actually need the nitrogen. So again, one thing to think about, if it grew a foot or more in the last season, you don't need to apply any more nitrogen because you've got plenty already there. Here's a amount of fertilizer to apply. So we're shooting for about a foot to 15 inches of growth. So if you didn't quite get that last year, then you want to go ahead and apply a quarter a quarter pound of ammonium nitrate a year for a year of age. 1 to 3 year old trees, you may double this amount of growth if you want to get a little more out of that. That first year, I probably wouldn't apply a lot, but after that, you can start applying it. And about a half a pound of granular fertilizer is equal to about 1 cup. So that'll just give you an idea of how much you actually put. Now, ammonium nitrate's not that readily available, so if you didn't use ammonium nitrate, you could still go ahead and use urea. It'll give a little more nitrogen, but it wouldn't be a big deal. So you can use urea for that application. So that's a quarter of a pound per year of age of the tree. Some other problems you may have are rabbits and voles. We talked about rabbits a little earlier, but we can also have vole trouble, especially in the wintertime. And rabbits, what they do is they'll just come up and they'll nibble the bark off your tree. The voles will actually do the same thing, but they'll burrow in under the tree and they'll live next to that trunk and they'll eat that the bark off the trunk during the wintertime. And by the time you notice it, the tree may be already girdled or damaged beyond it being able to heal itself. So what do? There's a few things you can do. You can put wire around it like they've done here. That'll keep the rabbits off. And if you bury that wire down some, you'll keep some of the voles off. Another thing you can do, especially for voles, is make sure that you keep a bare soil around that tree. You can see in that top picture where they've kind of had sprayed it before, but the grass has come back. But if you look at orchards, most of the time they'll keep Roundup or something sprayed on that grass underneath that tree and keep it bare. If you keep it bare, you're much less likely to have voles because they don't like to cross without some cover because of the cats or hawks or whatever will be out to eat them. So if you just spray that area and keep it bare, you'll have a much better chance of warding off those voles. So apple rootstocks, this is just how we end up getting our dwarf, semi-dwarf, or standard trees. Standard trees are generally grown on their own root. And then we've got, based on which rootstock we use, we can get different sizes of apples, mature size apple trees. And you can see that the Bud 118 is about 70% of a mature tree. And you can go all the way down to a Malling 9, which is only about 30% the size of a regular tree. So that's quite small. And then Bud 9 is used quite often in our area as well for more of a dwarf or semi-dwarf apple, which is much easier for us to take care of and spray. So here's more on the rootstocks again. Bud 9 is about 40% standard, which is used quite often around in our parts. It is hardy. It does have some fire blight and collar rot resistance, which is good. Remember, fire blight is a bacteria that gets into the plant. If it gets into that rootstock or that trunk, it can kill the plant. So having a rootstock that's resistant to it's good because you know it can't kill the root of that tree. We have G11, which is about 50% size. It's moderately fire blight and collar rot resistant. And then you also see it's very little suckering, which is good because a lot of these rootstocks may sucker and you have to keep those pruned out. But you can go way up to that MM111 there. It's 80% the size. And it's disease and woolly aphid resistant. Woolly aphid actually is an aphid that lives in the soil, and it will actually feed on the roots. So that's good to have that resistance there too. But most all of these are pretty commonly used rootstocks, especially in our area. So depending on which rootstock that you have on your plant, you're going to plant based on that. So if the tree's smaller, you can get more of those trees in an acre than if the trees are larger. So Bud 9 there, 10 by 16 to 12 by 18 spacing. And then depending on the varieties, it may be different that you have to even space them a little different based on the variety. So we also 8 by 16 or 12 by 18 spacing depending on which variety you use. But if you get anywhere close to these, you're going to be pretty happy with those on the spacing. Those are for Bud 9, and then you get more bigger or larger spacing based on growing a larger tree. So the closer spacing is for poor soil. The larger spacing is for fertile soil. So you know what you've got as far as fertility goes. If you have hard clay that's it stays hard all summer and all that, you're gonna have to space a little closer together. If you've got a nice silt loam, then you're probably gonna space a little further apart. There's several types of apple trees now and growth shapes. We have conventional spur type, and then there's star colonnade, which I kind of consider that just a novelty. But conventional is just your regular old apple tree, like is a seedling that you're used to growing up with. And the spur type there, you can see on that top left, it just has a lot of what it looks like little spurs up and down the branches. But what those are is just gives you more flowers because there are flower buds connected to those, which gives you a higher chance of having a large fruit load. Now, with the large fruit load comes also maybe needing to thin those, so keep that in mind. And then this star colonnade or spire shape there, they can produce apples, but you can see there they're more for novelty. People do grow apples on them, but you're not going to get the production you're going to get out of our conventional or spur type trees. Most of our apples will throw color sports or strains. Basically just one shoot mutates, and they'll take that and graft it onto a rootstock, and you've got a whole new apple variety. And you can see this has happened here with Jonathan is in the middle. That's the original. And then on the left there's Joni, which is, or Johnny, I guess is the way that's pronounced, which is more of a red. And then we've got, or deeper red, and we've got Jonna Red. Jonah Red there, that's on the right there, is just kind of a red with a little more yellow in it. But you can see these all originated from the same um, apple variety, but you ended up with three different colors here, which you can also get differences in flavors with these as well. So that's why we've got, new apple varieties just from a sport or a strain coming off of maybe a shoot or a bud mutated. And we don't know how that happens or why that happens, but with plants it happens pretty regularly. And they just grafted it and they have a whole new apple variety now. One of the biggest ways that you can reduce the number of sprays that you're going to have to spray your apple trees with is by planting disease-resistant cultivars. In our area, if you just planted a regular run-of-the-mill apple, you're going to need about 26 cover sprays to get a good apple production off of that. So if you plant apples that are resistant to a lot of diseases, you're going to have maybe not as many sprays, but also less harsh chemicals to at least get decent fruit that you would like to eat at home. So if you look at this chart here, AS is apple scab, CR is cedar apple rust, FB is fire blight, and PM is powdery mildew. So if you look at here at some of these, Pristine is one of my favorite apple varieties because it's early. It comes in mid-July, maybe even early July here in our part of the state. But it is very resistant to apple scab, but you can see it's susceptible to cedar apple rust. It's very susceptible to fire blight and susceptible to powdery mildew. So those are three diseases you're going to have to spray for regardless if you plant this one or a different variety. But once you spray for the fire blight and the spring what's in flower, you're going to, not worry about that one so much. But the cedar apple rust, you're going to have to stay on top of. And powdery mildew, I've seen a little bit of it when I grew this apple for several seasons, but not that bad. So if you go down through there and you say, well, which one do we want that's resistant to a lot of these? Depends on what, do you want an early apple or a mid to late apple? But if you look down through here, it looks like maybe Enterprise is one of those newer apples that is very resistant to a lot of these diseases. So it's Sundance and Gold Rush. Those are all kind of newer apples. Sundance is very resistant to all of these diseases. So that was definitely one you may want to put in your arsenal there or your orchard. But now you're still going to spray for insects. So don't, you're going to spray for these too, but not as much, not as bad as you would otherwise. Enterprise is very resistant to most of these too, are resistant. So is Priscilla. Maybe if you want it an earlier apple, you're going to have to spray a little bit more maybe. But, that's kind of the key. The great thing about an early apple is you have less insect sprays you have to put on probably. But you're going to have to do more, up front as far as diseases. But anyway, that just gives you an idea of some apples that are out there and whenever they'll actually come into being ripe. So again, disease and insect resistance is the key to growing a lower spray apple for your home use. So you want to select varieties again that are the biggest or largest disease and insect package that you can get. You can see there that's apple scab on the apple, and you can see what it does to the leaves there. And you can look back at that chart, and there are apples that are very resistant to it, which you won't have to worry about that disease as much. Doesn't mean it won't get it. It just doesn't mean that it just is not as susceptible as some other varieties would be. Here's some more scab immune varieties. We have red free there, Liberty in the middle, Priscilla on the right, which talked about that a little earlier. There's Gold Rush we talked about, Pristine, one of my favorite early apples there. Although it does have a few disease issues early in the season, it's also a very early apple, and it tastes a little like Gala, so it's a very good apple for us to grow there. And then we have Enterprise there on the right. Most of these are August and September apples, maybe even 1st of October, except for Pristine, which is going to be late June to mid-July. There's a few major diseases that you're going to come across if you're growing apples. There's fire blight on the top left, which is a bacteria, and when it gets into it kills branches back, and when it gets into the trunk, it can kill the trunk and kill the entire tree. So you definitely want to plant a resistant variety, or you're definitely going to have to stay on your spray program whenever that disease is active. We'll talk about the spray schedules here in just a little bit. On the right there's cedar apple rust. You can see those spots all over those leaves, and those leaves will eventually drop. Those spots can also get on your fruit. And that cedar apple rust, it gets on cedar one season and apple the next, but it has multiple generations of it, so it's on both plants every season, but it lives a 2-year life cycle. And then we have apple scab there on the bottom left, which we definitely want to get resistant varieties for that. And then there's frog eye, which you don't see all the time, but especially in wetter weather, you're going to see that at the bottom left or bottom right on the left picture. And then we have black rot there with that dead mummy fruit still hanging on there. That can, by leaving those mummy fruits on there, that's just giving a reservoir for that disease, and you don't want to leave those on there. So late or midwinter, if you still see those mummies on there, knock those off and get rid of those, because that's just a disease, another disease outbreak waiting to happen. Some insect problems. We have the codling moth there. That's the top left. That's the moth you usually see, or the worm you see in your apples. And then we have the San Jose scale there in the middle, which is a scale insect that sticks to the tree and sucks juice out of the tree. There's the rosy apple aphid there on the right, which curls the leaves, and you'll see the little fuzzy aphids curled under those leaves. The plum curculio, you can see this gives you a reason why you've got to do the early cover sprays. That's the key to controlling a lot of these. You see that pear in the bottom left. You see that little black mark already on that little fruit just forming. That is already damaged, and it'll be damaged until it's a full-size fruit. So you've got to get those early sprays on to get all this damage under control. And you may see spider mites some year. They're in the middle. European red mites, a two-spotted spider mite, either one. And then that on the right there, you can see that is distorted growth there. That's a potato leafhopper. After it feeds, it puts a toxin in, and it causes some deformity in your growth. So those are just a few insects that you may find out there that you're going to have to try to keep under control. So this is a scab immune apple, Co-op 29. This one did not have any disease sprays. It only had insecticide sprays only. So you can see that's a pretty decent apple. Don't worry about that dark, little mildewy looking stuff on that apple. That's called fly speck, and that washes off. There's no reason to worry about that. I'm sure many of you that grew up with people growing apples saw some of that on there, but it's just superficial on the outside of the skin. You can wash it off, or you can peel the apple, and you won't have to worry about that anymore. But you can see you still have to do if you do your insecticide sprays, if you have a very resistant apple variety, you still get a decent fruit. So here is a scab immune variety. This is Liberty, which is a scab immune just like the co-op variety before it was, but this one had no sprays at all. So it didn't have any disease sprays nor insect sprays. So you can see the insects still did damage to these apples. This is the entire yield on a 6-year-old Liberty apple, and you can see nothing there really looks much edible. So the insecticide sprays are just as important as the disease sprays. On to planting your fruit trees. You want your soil not too wet. You want it moist but not wet. You want to dig a large hole. Obviously, you want to be able to spread those roots out because most of the time, if you order these mail order, they're going to come bare root. Make sure you don't crowd those roots in the hole. Do not put fertilizer in the hole either, and only fill back with the soil that came out of the hole. I know in the old days, they would talk about amending that soil, backfill soil, and put it back in there. But we found out pretty quick that what that did was those roots just stayed in that good soil and never went out into the hard or the native soil, and they can end up girdling themselves. So just put the soil that came out of the hole back in there. That tree needs to get used to growing in that native soil, and that's the best way to make that happen. So if when you dig your hole, you want to make sure that you can spread those roots out in the hole. If there's any roots that are broken, you want to go ahead and cut those off. You want to set your tree graft union about 2 to 4 inches above the soil line, which is about where that person's hand is. Place topsoil in around the soil. Do not bring in good soil to fill the hole again. Only the soil that came out of the hole goes back. Firm the soil around the plant. Water in good to settle the soil around the roots. And then you probably want to either keep a label on the tree or make a map of where varieties are planted. That way you'll know for future reference, and also which are resistant to what diseases, and it may make a decision whether you want to grow more of that variety or less in the future. In the spring, you want to prune. Usually, it's late winter for our area, early spring, so end of February, the 1st of March, before bud break. Never prune in the fall. That's not a good idea for our fruit trees. Um, Also, we want to go ahead and put a rodent guard around those trees. If you know you've got um, rabbit or maybe even voles, and you can see there they even put a little gravel inside of that. That's going to help keep those voles off of that trunk of that tree as well. Also, you want to think about weed control. Again, you can spray around that or mulch around it. It's best to leave some bare soil or even mulch that they have to, grass around the tree, especially if you let it grow, 4, 5, 6 inches. That gives cover for those voles, and they'll be able to burrow in around that tree and girdle your trees because they like to eat that bark during the wintertime. This picture here is the planting of a Maxine pear tree, and you can see 25 years later what size that tree is. It's not a huge tree, so it was a semi-dwarf, but it just gives you an idea about how much that these trees can grow. Now, if that was a full-size tree, it'd probably be 30, 40 foot tall in that 25 years. I know this is a topic that's hard for most of us to actually do, but fruit thinning is a pretty big deal, especially on peaches and apples. We can get quite a load on both of these trees if we have a very good season. But you do want to thin these, especially for apples. You want to thin them earlier. You'll get a larger fruit with a higher sugar content. You will get a slightly lower yield, but you'll get a much better product. And who wouldn't rather have some nice large apples than 3 or 4 little golf ball size apples, which is not really good for most of us. You'd want to think about it this way. You want about 1 apple every 6 to 7 inches of branch. So if you got 2 or 3 hanging together, you want to pull off and only leave one in that section. Believe it or not, one of the insecticides that we actually use on a lot of our crops, fruit and vegetable for that matter, is 7. It actually will cause some drop on these apples. So um, about 30 days after bloom, if you spray 7 on these trees, it will cause some apples to fall off, which will kind of help thin those out for you. There's also a thing called June drop, which will drop some apples then too. But you want to don't wait for the June drop to occur because you want to get that drop a little earlier. You can go in and actually hand thin these if you don't have but a few small trees. But go ahead and spray 30 days after bloom, and it'll cause some chemical drop to occur, which is not a bad thing because you do want to reduce the amount of apples on here if we had one of those seasons where you just had too much of a good thing. So here is our simplified low spray schedule for backyard apple plantings. This is a simplified spray schedule that'll get you really good apples without having to do the 30 or 26 cover sprays in a season. So first off, we want to start with making sure that we plant the right variety. By the right variety, we mean the ones that are resistant to as many diseases as possible, especially scab. But if you can get cedar apple rust and fire blight in that resistant as well, that's great. But this chart here is from the University of Kentucky, and you can see there uh, the growth stage there when to first start spraying. So we've got our dormant spray, which is before your buds swell, so that's right now. Um, so for fire blight, you want to go ahead and spray some fixed copper. Again, always follow your label directions on this. It's for scale. If you know you've had that issue, do a dormant oil spray. So green tip to 1/2 inch green, that just means that we have a little growth on there. Fire blight, you're going to spray fixed copper again. For scale, you can go ahead and do it dormant oil if you need to, and then for scab, you can go ahead and hit it with Cap-10, which is a fungicide. So just before blooms open, if you go on down through there, again, cedar apple rust and scab, you're going to hit it with Cap-10. Because some of these fungicides, like Cap-10, will control multiple diseases, so that's why we stick with some of those that can control more than one. We don't have to buy as many different types of sprays that way. And by this point, you're going to start spraying your first insecticide that actually is going to target pests that can eat your leaves and your fruit, which we're going to be targeting aphids, tarnished plant bugs, stink bugs, those kinds of things. Malathion is the one you're going to hit for that. And you don't have to spray it if you don't want to, but it's only if the insects are present. For most of us, there are probably going to be at least a few of those present. And then during bloom, we don't spray any insecticide when it's in bloom ever. We do not want to kill bees. Bees are our friends, pollinators. They get out there and they're pollinating our flowers to make sure we get good fruit. But the one thing we do want to worry about is some of these funguses and bacteria that we need to control. So for cedar apple rust and scab, when they're in bloom, we can spray Cap-10 and Immunox. Immunox is a systemic and can't be washed off, so it actually goes into the tree. So we don't spray those kinds of things on edible fruit that often, but if we do it really early where we make sure it's gone by the time the fruit is ripe. And then for fire blight during full bloom, it's optional for fire blight control every 4 days for a total of no more than 4 days. Sprays for maximum control, but streptomycin, if you can get it, is going to be your #1 spray to stop your fire blight, which is a bacteria. Streptomycin is an antibiotic. If you can't find the streptomycin, you can go ahead and use fixed copper instead, which will not be as good as the streptomycin, but it will be a lot better than not spraying anything. This fire blight usually gets into the flowers during pollination, so the bees inadvertently get this bacteria on their feet or whatever, and when they land on the flower, it can go down into the flower and get into the stem that way. Also, by spraying your streptomycin or your fixed copper, if you have any open wounds on that plant where that fire blight overwintered and it's become active again, you can spray over that and it'll help kill that bacteria oozing from there. Then after your petals fall, we're going to spray Cap-10 and Immunox for cedar apple rust, scab, fruit rot, those kinds of things. And then we're going to spray Malathion for codling moth and plum curculio, which every year are going to be out there, so you know you're going to have to hit them with that one. And then every 2 weeks after that, which this still seems like a lot of spraying, I know, but if you follow this, you'll make sure you get good fruit. So every 2 weeks after that, we're going to spray Cap-10 for our fruit rots. We're going to spray Malathion or spinosad for the codling moth, the plum curculio, and these are just going to be our cover sprays. I'd go ahead and just use Malathion if I was you. And then if you have a mite problem, you can hit them with insecticidal soap. Mite problems are not going to be a yearly occurrence. It may not be an ever occurrence, but if you've had an outbreak, you're going to have to go ahead and hit those with an insecticidal soap. And then for the sooty blotch and the fly speck, if you just don't want to see that on there, even though you can just peel it off or wash it off, top some in, which I've never sprayed for any of that on my own backyard fruit because I don't mind that. I can just wipe that off or even peel it off. And then if we have Japanese beetles, which some years they're really bad now, some years they aren't, we all spray with 7. And then San Jose scale, we hit them with a horticultural oil if they've been out there, and that'll target the crawlers as well. And one of note, avoid using 7 or Cap-10 within 14 days of an oil application because you can cause some foliage burn with that. So here's another home orchard spray schedule for disease-resistant apples. So if you go back, the first one was for conventional, just regular apple varieties, not necessarily resistant apple varieties. This is the one we're going to, if you plant resistant apple varieties, this is the actual schedule that you're going to follow. So at dormant, you're going to spray for fire blight with fixed copper, dormant oil for scale, and then at green tip, you're going to spray fixed copper for fire blight again, and you're going to spray dormant oil for scale again if it's needed. And then at pink, it's just for your blooms open. Again, you're going to spray malathion for the aphids, tarnished plant bugs, and stink bug. And then at bloom, you're going to do cedar for cedar apple rust. You're going to spray with lime sulfur or immunox. I'd probably do immunox since it is systemic and it'll give you a little better control. And then again, streptomycin for your fire blight. Never spray any insecticide during bloom again because we don't want to kill the pollinators. And then after petals fall, we're going to hit them with malathion for the collie moth and plum curculio. And then every 2 weeks after that, we're going to follow that schedule there of the malathion for the collie moth, the plum curculio, cap 10 for your fruit rots. I'd skip the topsin in for the sooty blotch and the fly speck again because that's just superficial. If you have spider mites, we're hitting with insecticidal soap, and then 7 for Japanese beetles while they're active. And then if you have the San Jose scale, you can hit them with the horticultural oil. But you can see that's a much condensed spray schedule compared to the one to it. So it gives you an idea by planting resistant varieties, how you can reduce your spray. But either one of these are still simplified fruit spray schedules for apples, which is much simpler than what we used to have out. And it'll make sure that you get good apples that you can be proud to grow, be proud to show people that you grew, and that you can either give away, sell, or freeze and can for yourself. So here is a list of insecticides that I put together. If you want to do some sprays for yourself and just give you a list of what you might need. These are the insecticides. If you're going to do the conventional, you need 7, which is carbaryl, endosulfan, maybe, which is thionex, and then malathion. Definitely 7 in malathion. If you want to go organic, and I will tell you right now, in Kentucky, trying to grow apples organically is almost impossible, even with the fruit trees you got now that are so resistant to a lot of these insects and diseases, is that we just live in a petri dish and we just have a high number of diseases and insects that can hit these plants. And with our weather, it's just hard to stay on top of them. But if you want to try it, you can try neem oil, you can try BT for some of the caterpillars. Insecticidal soap, which will, is a knockdown for some of these insects. Pyrethrum is a knockdown as well. And if you want to do any of the spray oils or all of that, any of that, it's going to be better than nothing, but it's not going to give you the control as some of these conventional insecticides do. For your fungicides, if you're going to do conventional, you're going to need some Captan, chlorothalonil, or Daconil, depending on if you're growing apples or peaches or whatever. For peaches, you're going to definitely need chlorothalonil, not necessarily for your apples. You may need Furbam or carbamate. You may need Dithane, which is mancozeb, myclobutanil, which is Immunox, or Topsum M if you're worried about the fly speck. But I'm going to, if you're looking at this right now, I'm going to say you're going to definitely need Captan. Definitely going to need Immunox for apples. You may need Daconil in the future if you plant other fruit trees such as peaches and those. But you can get by with just 2 or 3 of those, but definitely the Captan and the Immunox for your apples. If you want to try organic, we do have a little bit of more fungicides for organic control than we do for the insecticides. I'm sorry. Anyway, the Bordeaux mixture is good if you can find it. Fixed copper is always going to be good. It'll help you with your bacteria more than your fungicides. Liquid lime sulfur will help you, especially if you've grown peaches, so you're going to need that if you don't have Daconil, but to stop the peach leaf curl. Wettable sulfurs are also good. They're kind of similar, work similarly to Cap-10, but not as good. And then we have streptomycin, which is a bactericide. And I don't know that I would even put that as organic, but it may be something that you want to think about it as an antibiotic. Another way you can get around having to spray your apples, believe it or not, this would be time consuming, but they've done it, and they do it in a lot of foreign countries, is bagging the apples, which they actually do sell these paper bags. Is that when the apple first forms, you actually do attach this paper bag to the apples, and then that keeps any insects or diseases off of that apple during the growing season. So you get a good a good harvest without any blemishes or anything on the fruit. Now it's going to be time consuming, a lot of work, and also you can see there that the color that this apple variety was supposed to be red, and you can see that was in that bag, so the apple kind of comes out almost white. I'm not sure that it affects the flavor that much, but it does definitely affect the appearance. Here's some more disease-resistant apple cultivars. This is from UK, and you can see we talked about some of these earlier, but this just has a few more varieties on it. You can see how they're resistant to uh, scab, which is almost all of them resistant, very resistant to apple scab, which is great. Cedar apple rust, some of them are susceptible, fire blight, susceptible, moderate resistant, and powdery mildew is resistant. Um, Two of my favorite apple varieties actually is at the top of that chart there, Pristine and Williams Pride. Williams Pride is a nice red apple, and Pristine is more of a yellowish with a little blush of kind of pink, maybe red on it. But they are also early, which also reduces the number or the chances of more insects damaging that fruit later in the season. But they are early. Some people are not ready to have apples in mid-July, so just keep that in mind. You may want to spread your harvest out by having several varieties here. But cedar apple rust is one of those diseases that they both are very susceptible to, and you will have to stay on a spray schedule for that. So here's 7. You can use it. It's kind of our go-to for Japanese beetles and June bugs. You can put it on grapes. You can put it on apples. You can put it on most of our things in our garden. But it is again toxic. It is an insecticide, and it can be toxic to us if we get in it too much. It is one of the components of many of our all-purpose spray mixtures. Some of the fruit tree sprays out there, which I really sometimes will use those in places of some of these other individual sprays that we talked about. The fruit tree spray that you can buy around here, it usually has 7 malathion and cap-10 in it, so you're getting insecticide and fungicide control. One thing to keep in mind though, with 7, if you know you've had a mite problem, spraying 7 on those mites actually stresses the mites out and causes them to reproduce more, which can actually make your mite trouble worse. It doesn't kill them, it just stresses them, so keep that in mind. It also can be used for apple and pear thinning, which we talked about earlier. So it doesn't work on peaches and some other fruits, but it does work on apple and pear. So it will only thin up to about 30 days after full bloom. So you've got to go ahead and spray it early. Don't wait too long after the petals fall. Um, and then again, it will only thin apples and pears. Some spray equipment you might need. I wouldn't necessarily use these, probably this one, to spray my apple trees, but you can try it. It's inexpensive. It's easy to operate. Doesn't have much range though, and it also would spray a lot more insecticide than you really need up in those trees, which would be wasting a lot of product, and it'd also be hard to keep it off of you if you use this. This is a trombone sprayer here. This will spray up to 25 feet, which gets up in a tree nice. And you only have to mix it into a bucket, and you just put the hose down in the bucket. But you have to push that back and forth. Um, it all is, it's going to be good distance, but it's going to be hard to keep any spray off of you using this. So if you're using this, you definitely want to put some cover on. You don't go like this guy out there with just a shirt, with your sleeves rolled up, because you're going to get a lot of back spray and drippage down on you if you're using this. So probably not the best, but it does give you some, high 25 feet, pretty good range up in that tree. Most of us that just got several trees are going to use these hand pump sprayers. They're relatively inexpensive. It does reduce your spray drift on your applicator because you got the hose, the wand, and then you're targeting your sprays where you want to. They do sometimes have a short range, so if you're trying to spray a conventional tree, this is probably not going to be the best, but for a semi-dwarf or dwarf, these are great. Also, a backpack sprayer is similar to your pump-up spray, except you're carrying on your back, and you've got that handle there that you can just constantly spray. Which these are really great once you get them on your back. Some people may not be able to handle that load because you're talking about 4 or 5 gallons in the back of that, so it can be quite heavy. May be easier to use the other types if you can't stand with that on your back. They usually cost about $150 around there. These are also really nice. You can target your sprays where you want. It reduces your spray drift on you, so you don't have to worry about that as much. And then you can also get these extensions for your wand, which will help you get further up into that tree, and it also gets that spray further away from you, which is nice. And you can even get the nozzles that swivel, so you can really concentrate that spray up in under the leaves instead of like you need to get total control coverage. So with that swivel, you can get up under those leaves easily too, and you can just move that swivel the way you need it for each tree. And then others, this is a battery powered, which goes in the back of an ATV, and it hooks. It has a motor in it, and you just run it to the motor on the ATV, and you no pumping. You just got spray coming from that. That's really great. These are you can see there 15 gallons, $214, 230 for a 25 gallon. They may be more than that now, so they can be expensive. But if you've got a lot of trees, this may be a good option. It keeps you from having to carry the water or the liquid. It also keeps you from having to pump. So that's really nice and convenient too. And you can get a pretty good spray up into that tree with these, 25, 30 feet pretty easily. And then this is a backpack mist blower. The mist blowers are usually the best at getting your product up into that tree and getting a lot of coverage on it. But you can see that this is very expensive. You're looking at $600, $700 there. Most of us are not going to do that for home fruit. It's also very heavy, but it will concentrate your spray where you want. But another thing is you have to calibrate it, which can be difficult. So this is for professionals, not necessarily most of us homeowners. But I just want to put it in there to let you know they're out there. And then obviously we have these commercial air blast sprayers, which is what the commercial people do. And they're riding on the truck or the tractor, I'm sorry, in front of that, and they're pulling this air blast. And this air blast is spraying this mist out into the trees, and it's getting full coverage. As you can see there, it's covering those trees. You can't even see them anymore. So this is what the commercial people use. Don't plant too many trees, so you would need something like this unless you want to actually go into commercial production. It is, for most of us, difficult to justify having this kind of sprayer and mixing up this much product at a time unless you had, 50, 100 trees at least. But if you just got 5 or 10 in the backyard, this is just not doable. But I do want you to see what the commercial people use. More weed control. I know we saw that picture earlier, but how to control the weeds around these, you mulch. You can use a weed eater, but keep in mind you don't want to hit that trunk. You're going to cause wounds, which fire blight can get in. You also can girdle the tree. You also can use a hoe if you need to. Most commercial production are using Roundup, which is quite easy for us to use as well. Generally, once that tree gets a little bark on it, the Roundup's not going to be able to get into that tree. So you just put that spray down at the base of that and spray those weeds around the tree, and you'll keep that spot bare. If you do keep it bare, that's going to help keep the voles away as well. Here's some spray calculations. Just put that in there because some people may need it at some point. A pound is 16 ounces, an ounce is 28 grams, those kinds of things. If it just help you mix up your pesticides whenever you're doing it based on what your label says, but this is just to give you an idea of to help you convert some of those measurements into tablespoons or milliliters, whatever you may need. So if you have any questions on growing low spray apples, you can always call me at the Washington County Extension Office at 859-336-7741. If anyone out there would like to have a hard copy of this PowerPoint, you can also call. We'll mail you one for free, so you can just call the office here and ask to have the low spray apple PowerPoint mailed to you, and we'll send it out. Happy gardening!